New England, and we're joined live by David Weber, who will start that session. David, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Nick. Thanks for inviting me as usual. I feel like it's increasingly become my role at these World Pension Summits that Nick pulls together to, I feel like we'll have these panel discussions and it'll be like, and now to cut away to this to some bad news from America on these issues. So that's my job is to report on the bad news from America. And in particular, I want to focus on what I'm sure some of you have heard about, and which is the recent United States Department of Labor's proposed a new regulation on proxy voting. It's almost breathtaking in its ambitiousness and its hostility to everything that we believe in this group of people. So basically what's happened, some of you may already know about some of their guidance from earlier this summer on ESG, but just a couple of weeks ago, the US Department of Labor proposed a regulation that would essentially flip the burden on proxy voting away from a requirement to vote and towards almost a requirement not to vote, really. It's not quite put that way, but effectively, that's what it is. So as I know I don't need to spend a lot of time persuading this group about the important role that pensions have played, in shareholder activism and driving the ESG agenda. It's beyond abundant evidence here. One that pops to mind was the fact that the United Brotherhood of Carpenters pension fund filed over 700 shareholder proposals to push for quite successfully push for majority voting at hundreds and hundreds of US publicly held companies. And so what this new regulation would do is, so a little bit of background, for a couple of decades now, the default rule has basically been this, that the right to vote your proxies is an asset of a pension plan. And previously, pensions just never voted. And corporate managers loved this arrangement. Many people love this arrangement. And the United States Department of Labor came along and said, look, proxy voting, the right to vote your proxy is an asset of the plan. And as an asset of the plan, okay, it has fiduciary implications if you're just letting it go to waste, if you're not using it to advance the interests of the pension fund. And this was in part what helped launch the proxy voting as we now know it, so that pension funds are voting at thousands of shareholder meetings every year, the rise of ISS, and so on and so forth. Much of the industry that we operate in today was in part, I don't want created, maybe too strong a word, but certainly wind was put into the sails of this movement by that view. And along comes the US Department of Labor, summer of 2020, and now flips the presumption by basically requiring pensions to do cost-benefit analysis before ever voting the proxy. They have to demonstrate, right? They have to demonstrate why it would be beneficial to the fund to vote and to vote in a particular way. They have to, more importantly, these things always play out less on the substance and really much more on the procedure. That is, they're going to have to demonstrate that they undertook a particular study, that they paid for some kind of analysis, that it was reviewed by the fiduciaries, and that's where they really get you, because in a way, the single biggest cost would be complying with this requirement. It's one of these. The regulation's main move is to increase the cost to make it impossible to do this kind of voting in the first place. And if you fail to demonstrate that you've undertaken such a process, now the presumption is flipped that fiduciaries could be vulnerable to claims from the US Department of Labor that they have breached their fiduciary duties to the fund in undertaking this unnecessary expense. And added to this substantive change in the law, the US Department of Labor has spent the summer subpoenaing and demanding documents be turned over from all sorts of investment funds to demonstrate how they're going about their ESG investing. So there's two things going on. There is the substantive change in the law, and there is the signal from the US Department of Labor that is saying, by the way, this isn't just verbiage. We are going to come after you about it. So in case you didn't believe that the forthcoming presidential election had any consequences, now we have some tangible, some additional tangible evidence of such. There is some silver lining here. As with the earlier ESG guidance, many investment managers are deeply unhappy about this. Even ones who wouldn't ordinarily necessarily be politically or ideologically aligned with worker pension funds don't like this. There is also, its scope is that, some funds that I've talked to, for example, who basically have a strategy of indexing and voting, think that they're going to, they index and they vote, and then they vote the proxies the way they want them. Let's say they vote them in accordance with AFL-CIO voting guidelines. They're not feeling too vulnerable to this because they think, because their costs are basically nothing in their voting. So it's not, it's a serious threat. Let's put it that way. There are also, I think, some fascinating legal challenges that may be mounted. I'm sure will be mounted, actually, if this goes through. One of the interesting moves that a colleague of mine, Ann Lipton at Tulane Law School, pointed out. She looked very closely at how the U.S. Department of Labor defined the obligations of a fiduciary, of a trustee, in this context, right, in the proxy voting context, and pulled out and looked at the exact same definition of how the Department of Labor defined fiduciary duty in the broker advisory context. And they're quite different. And this really very nicely, I think, tees up a litigation challenge that this definition and the way they went about it is arbitrary and capricious, which are the two buzzwords under US law to challenge administrative action. If they're just coming up with one convenient definition for fiduciary duty in the context of proxy voting and an entirely different definition of fiduciary duty in the context of brokers, one in which they're trying to protect brokers and trying to harm proxy voters, that doesn't look good for them. So I think that that was a legal mistake that they have made that may jeopardize this whole project. Nick, I'm not entirely sure how much time I have. Maybe I should just pause there or I don't know how, okay. I'll stop there and happy to discuss further.
Exactly. That was exactly what I was going to say. So stay on because we're going to ask you more questions later on. Just before we move to Konstantinos in Parma, I think, because
absolutely.
I think in normal circumstances,
COVID-19.
Exactly. My Hellenic, my Byzantine Hellenic compatriot is jet setting ecologically in train or bicycling between Glasgow and Parma. But I think now you're in Parma for the time being, which is not a bad place to be locked in. But before we move to just a comment based on what a personal comment based on what David just said. I mean. First, the timing of Eugene Scalia's, horrible decision, really during the summer or at the beginning of the summer break, as if it was time, to be buried on page whatever 35 of your local newspaper. So it's quite a cowardly timing. It's really not very honest intellectually or politically, and also something else that shocked me. Even with cynical. Ultra-capitalist, whatever eyes, if you look at things, and based on what also Nick Silver said earlier, that with the Business Roundtable, even the most capitalist tycoons on Wall Street are going through the motion of pretending that they care about tree hugging or social progress. So in that cultural environment, to get that signal from the U.S. Department of Labor, something that reactionary and retro, it's even like that's an early 70s or whatever, early 19th century retro feel, was shocking. And something else which was shocking is is many of Trump's voters, if you believe, the opinion polls coming from, or if you believe the research coming from some American, whatever, sociologists about the voting patterns, many of the voters who voted for President Trump in 2016 were actually self-professed, Roman Catholics. And if you look at Laudato Si, the encyclical that was published 5 years ago, ESG is now practically like, a pillar of the Catholic, worldview officially. And it always was, in my opinion, but I think the Laudato Si encyclical made it even clearer that ESG is really something that is based in part on the teachings of the church fathers, blah, blah, blah. So the fact that Eugene Scalia, himself a self-professed church-going, American Catholic, would take such an extreme, radically reactionary anti-ESG stance in the middle of the summer, cowardly 7 weeks ago, was really a shock to me personally. But anyway, enough.
Can I squeeze in just a quick detail? One other interesting feature of what they did was they only left a 30-day comment period. I mean, I know this is really getting into the legal weeds, but typically for such a massive change, it would be 3 times as long. And it just illustrates precisely the point you were just making, I think.
5th of October, David. We still have time.
I wonder what's the point of these things, these
to go through the long document, yes.
Konstantinos, over to you in Parma.
Thank you, Nicola, and thanks for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here with you. It's an exciting World Summit. It's my first time, so thank you again for allowing me to join your party. I was paying attention to also the very interesting discussions we had yesterday, and what Joe said struck me about being critical about standardization. Of course, Joe reiterated the whole argumentation in much more detail today. And I think I'm somewhere between Joe and Lorraine. I mean, I agree and I disagree with Joe at the same time, and I will tell you in a second, Joe, why. And of course, Ronnie Cohen was also very, very spot on in saying that the future is held by stakeholders, in the sense that we need to mobilize consumers and employees and all these things, all these interested parties, in order to achieve some concrete change. So let me then stick to these 2 points. So ESG and the law in the first place, and then in the second place, I will go to the employee part, since our panel also treats employees. And of course, needless to say, I hope you have all read David's excellent book on employee share ownership. I will try, David, humbly to take things one step further, and I look forward to your comments as well. So David gave you the bad news about the US, and actually I was about to do the same. So let me skip that part by just adding, David and all, that one of the most dangerous things that the US Department of Labor is doing right now is also creating this list of permitted practices. So not only threatening indirectly funds, but also telling them that if you do these things, you are in a safe harbor situation with me. So educationally speaking, it is even more harmful, because we start educating the new generation of funds towards disempowerment of their voice, and keep on conveying the message. And of course, this is, in the US, is not just expressed via the US Department of Labor, is a more general political trend. Your voice doesn't count. And if your voice doesn't count enough, it's better not to vote at all, which is one of the permitted practices for these funds. I think that we have to stick to details because this is very, very important. So let me now show you the relationship between law and ESG in Europe. I will not, of course, repeat what we all know in this panel, but the EU is doing certain things towards ESG. Of course, we have moved with the Shareholder Rights Directive. We are now pushing asset owners and asset managers to disclose how they engage, if they engage with other parties in the investment chain. ESG is there. And we also have things for proxy advisors, much less aggressive things for proxy advisors, because it's mainly about disclosure. And again, the US trend is let us weaken the role that proxy advisors play, because of course, it's a question of how do you ensure issuer accountability in the US, which in the EU is seen as a different thing, and how we also achieve accountability of proxy advisors. US is using the empowerment of proxy advisors, in the EU, we keep on going with disclosure. And I am for the disclosure trend here, and I will explain later why. So we also have the EU taxonomy in the EU. We now have started defining the sustainable investment criteria, more standardization. I know that Joe is hitting up for the debate later, but you know, I think that it is a good starting point, because what Joe is analyzing, and I am with him at 100%, is that all funds should be doing their homework before reaching to the stage of saying, oh, do we have anything standardized here, in order to look at specific details and then make an informed decision. But the problem is, Joe and others, that every time I talk to funds, let's say, who are not that well prepared, or funds that are located in a country where ESG has not come up to the surface, they struggle. So they tell me, and they tell other people as well, give us some standardized data in order to have a good starting point. And I will come back to it in a second. So the law has a clear role to play. And of course, in the US, we see that the law is instrumentalized in order to weaken or even kill ESG. In the EU is completely different. Now, if we go to how ESG can play out with standardization, I think that, I do not know if Joe is, again, will be satisfied with what I'm going to propose. Let's move on with a little bit of standardization, acknowledging, Joe, that it will have its perfectible features. I'm using a gentle diplomatic term. At the same time, clearly passing on the message to all market actors that there is an additional breathing space, and you should be looking at additional factors. So standardization just in order to do a little bit of box ticking, but this should not constitute a very good excuse for you as a fund to do your own homework and then to show to your beneficiaries that I have done what the law asks me to do. Because of course, standardization on the other side is also a good safeguard for investors as well, in order not to be held accountable by other parties in the investment chain, by also reminding people that we should be paying attention, basically what Joe said, we should be paying attention to what matters to us, and standardization should not become a one-size-fits-all approach by blocking us from examining other factors. So I'm basically advocating for a mixture of approaches, a little bit of standardization in order to bring up to the surface in terms of knowledge, awareness, and confidence some ESG funds that are still struggling with their ESG strategies, and then at the same time allow the more sophisticated funds to keep on playing more actively and in a more, let's say, diversified way. Let me now take you to the employees. Why employees and why now? Pandemic has clearly shown that the S part of the ESG trend is truly, truly, truly crucial. And we will be stuck, as Lorraine said as well, it's the new now, it's not the new normal. So we will be stuck with this reality for many, many years. Now, what I have been doing this year, Nick, I'm sure you're not going to be satisfied with what I'm going to propose, is if we are still waiting for something drastic to happen in order to drop completely shareholder governance and eliminate shareholder governance and come up with a completely radical new model, I think that it might be a safer option to keep shareholder governance for now and try to make it much more holistic in terms of how we engage with other stakeholders and we make them part of corporate governance processes. Under that kind of premise, I have come up with a new model with Dr. Andreas Kokinis, and we published our paper this year. We say that we could advocate for wider employee share ownership schemes with tax benefits, with discounted shares, other things in order to incentivize employees to start getting more and more shares, and eventually allow them in the future, if their share capital participation keeps on increasing, to also appoint employees in the board of directors, but with a slight change. In the UK, as you know, following the Brexit vote that demonstrated frustration amongst a huge part of the population, at least the majority part of the population, the Financial Reporting Council came up with 3 recommendations in the UK Corporate Governance Code. So companies now are invited on a comply or explain basis to either have employee advisory panels, employees on the board of directors, or NEDs dealing with employee matters. We say that the employee ownership that we are proposing fits perfectly with employee advisory panels. And let me take you quickly through our concrete proposals. The employee advisory panels are not like work councils and trade unions. In fact, they have nothing to do with what we've known so far. We should let companies introduce these employee advisory panels with an open agenda. The employees would actually would become candidates for election. It would be an open system. They would not have to go through trade unions or work councils or any other form that we have known so far. So this is perfect for millennials. We keep on accusing and criticizing millennials of changing jobs every 6 months, but we need to come up with new platforms that will be holistic and will be appealing to all of them, to all workers, both the millennials and the other, let's say, the more traditional forms of employment. So let's create employee advisory panels, give them carte blanche. They decide what to do. The company will let them free to do whatever they want, and they should engage with boards. Our purpose is to start filling the knowledge gap. I know, because I'm always in touch with investors and companies. Even in employee-owned companies, sometimes employees do not want to be part of the board of directors because they are afraid, because they have not been accustomed to the realities of what it takes to be in the board of directors. And when I see political agendas about wealth redistribution due to income inequality, which are things, of course, that exist in life, and then advocating 40%, for example, as Elizabeth Senator Warren advocating the Capitalism Act last year, I think that we are moving towards a wealth redistribution in order to fight populism and income inequality, but we are not dealing with employees as such in the long term. What do I mean by that? Stop discussing about putting employees on the board if you haven't prepared them in the first place to assume such role. So our employee advisory panels are a normal conduit to then appointing employees on boards, but we do it gradually, incrementally, and after having allowed them to sit on that panel with an open election process, and while being able to interact with the board of directors during 2 or 3 years, and then they get the knowledge and the training from companies that we want them to get in order then to move on and become parts of the board of directors, members of the board of directors, if that's what they want. And the last thing, Nicholas, and then the floor is yours, we should also start having optional charters in each and every company. We should let companies discuss these charters with the panels, the employee advisory panels, create these charters in order to discuss the status of part-time workers or the frequency of the panel meetings or the items discussed. Again, items that will be decided by the employees themselves. But I feel, and that's my last comment, Nicholas, that in an ever-changing society, with all the challenges that we have, of course, Nick is right, we should expect more from ESG funds and they should just go drastically and change things. But in the meantime, I urge ESG funds to go and adopt some proposals like ours or David's, for example, in order to start changing incrementally things. Because while it's good to be drastic and decisive about what you want to achieve, it's also very, very important to start setting a basis in order to fill these knowledge gaps and empower employees in the long term to play a bigger role. And going back to Senator Sir Cohen's point yesterday about consumers, why not doing the same thing for consumers? Let's create consumer panels as well. I know it sounds too gentle and too diplomatic and it will take ages to materialize, but we have lots of ways in order to create long-term evolution in these matters. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Konstantinos. And before we move to the island of Tasmania to hear Nick Cherry's comments on your proposal for these boards, I'd like to, that we have received many questions, some of them specifically for David. So we'll move back to Boston first for a few seconds. And so there was one question for David in particular, and then I'll add my own question to him. So the first one is, what is the motivation behind that July 2020 shocking decision by the Department of Labor, or to use a Roman legal term, cui bono, so who's profiting financially or materially from that decision? That's the first question. Go ahead, David.
This is a Trump administration payoff to the oil industry, basically. What happened is a couple of years ago, some representatives from the energy industry went to the White House to complain about ESG and to complain about how about these constant sort of shareholder campaigns, et cetera. And so what happened is the Trump White House issued an executive order to the U.S. Department of Labor to revisit the question of fiduciary duty and ask, is it in fact consistent with fiduciary duty for all these pension funds to be making shareholder proposals on environmental issues, right? I mean, as you all know, for a long time, ESG and maybe the E piece in particular, sort of the G came first, then came the E, and the S is still kind of trying to make it into the arena. But E issues as shareholder proposals and such were very marginal and seen as political for a long time until they moved to the center. And so the Trump White House issued this executive order to DOL. And they, you know, and under Scalia, they spent some time looking at this, but I think the specific purpose was to figure out how to silence this voice and to defang it. And these proposals would go a long way towards doing that. I mean, some of it is rooted in certain academic debates and so forth. I mean, there was a very influential paper by Sitkoff and Sanzenbach in the Stanford Law Review, which basically made the arguments that DOL has adopted. Basically saying they went very, very far. You know, the typical rule here was the so-called investments of equal value rule, which was to say, if you're a fiduciary and you're looking at two investments of equal value, you know, risk, return, and so forth, you can choose A over B for any reason. And this was the legal door through which the ESG movement was able to step. And the Sitkoff-Sanzenbach paper basically said, no, actually, if you're choosing between two investments of equal value, diversification should require you to invest in both. And that was sort of part of the logic there, you know, behind this guidance and the new movement inside DOL. I just also want to shift briefly and just say, you know, I'm sorry that I was not familiar with your paper before, Konstantinos. I will definitely read it. It's really fascinating and provocative in my view, that, you know, this incremental approach, which is precisely what we would need in the United States, because it's a great idea. I mean, one genuine question, I don't have a view on it, but one genuine question I have for you would be, you know, one of the constant criticisms of like putting workers on boards in the US is like, we love to look at the German model and say, look what they have there. But Germany also has far greater unionization rates than we do. And therefore, there's some muscle behind that worker vote. It's not just a random worker plucked out of the employee population. And so I wonder, how would you speak to that issue for your proposal in a US context? How would you speak to that particular issue in the US? I mean, wouldn't workers on, how do we sufficiently arm workers on worker councils that you propose, given that particular issue?
Okay, let's ask that question actually to both Konstantinos and Nick Cherry. And let's start with Nick Cherry, because you may not know it, before becoming a global thought leader and a policymaker, in his early days, the Right Honorable Nick Cherry was also a trade union labor man. And so he also has multiple hats. And so let's ask him the question first rhetorically, and then back to Konstantinos. Nick, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Nick. Unlike David Weber, where it's all bad news from the US, it's all good news from Australia, and some very interesting and exciting developments in the last month, which not only have had major, and it's hard to understate, or sorry, it's hard to overstate the impact in Australia, but also do have some interesting global implications, particularly the Rio and the AMP cases, and the influence and impact of pension funds applying ESG, the very tough ESG approach to both Rio and AMP. And I'll come to that briefly later. But in the context of Konstantinos' suggestion, I mean, I can recall being a lay trustee with no particular knowledge or background of being a trustee of investments, etc., when I became a trustee of what's now a very large pension fund in Australia back in the late 1980s. And what's interesting, Australia has a fiduciary duty on the trustees, and it's a trustee-governed pension system. That's the law. and all decision making is required by the trustees. The buck stops with the trustees. What has been interesting, and there are a number of interrelated reasons as to why this is having now a profound effect, the trustee fiduciary duty in ESG and other areas, is that, and it has taken a long time, I'll concede that, but the system is now so large in Australia, the pension funds are now so large, they're 150% of the economy. And for trustees, the trustee mix is interesting. Certainly you've got your former CEOs, your lawyers, financial officers, but you do have a good mix of lay trustees and independent lay trustees. But they've evolved over time, ironically, I think, because the prudential regulator has required them to become, trustees in Australia now are semi-professional. They're paid, and they have minimum training requirements. And I think it's all fine to have enthusiastic and interested people involved in decision making, whether it's trustees or workers' councils, and not necessarily trade union representatives. But you've got to arm them. They've got to have not just the capacity, but the capability, the knowledge. And in Australia's case, that has taken a long time, but it's now having a real impact into our system. And the fact is that if you're a trustee of a pension fund, when I started 35 years ago as a trustee and then moved into the Australian Senate and other roles, 35 years ago, when I was a trustee, no one even thought about ESG issues. It just was not a topic of conversation. But as society has evolved, the trustee attitudes, interests and approach has evolved with the evolution of society, because the trustees come from society and it's a compulsory system. Everyone's in. So in a sense, the trustees, they have to take account of the members, and the members are society. So it's an interesting shift. And of course, the size of the Australian system at 150% of GDP, the other interesting aspect is that the trustees do have access to independent lines of inquiry through special units that are now established in almost all the funds. These funds have developed very sophisticated units for analysis on ESG issues. And they're expected to vote their shares. And when you own the majority of the Australian economy, that has a profound impact. I'll finish on this point. Again, for David, the Australian pension funds are globalising, so I don't want to overstate the case from little old Australia, but it's the fourth largest pension system in the world. They're investing overseas, and they are imparting this approach wherever they invest overseas. So I know our pension funds that have been investing in, particularly in the US, have been requiring the same ESG approach mainstreamed into where they invest. And what was striking, two quick cases, Nick, and I'll finish, which are very exciting and have really shaken up the corporate world in Australia, is the recent Rio case. The Australian pension funds took the lead. Rio, the mining company, headquartered in the UK, interestingly, despite the fact that most of the business is in Australia. The Australian pension funds were 20% of the shareholding of Rio, the rest is outside Australia. And they Rio blew up some Aboriginal sacred site caves when they were mining. And there was obviously a significant outcry in Australia in particular. And the investigation found that no one could be held accountable. They couldn't find out who'd given the orders to blow the caves up. and this was regarded as so inadequate by the Australian pension funds, the conclusion, that the pressure was so great that last week the CEO and 2 senior executives had to resign, and there were other very significant changes. So that Rio case is really interesting, not just in Australia but globally.
Great.
And the second, sorry, I'll finish, Nick. The second case, which again does have Australian and global implications, is AMP, the largest pension fund itself, insurance company in Australia. Royal Commission, the CEO and the chair had to quit, and then only 2 weeks ago, that was 18 months ago, over mis-selling of financial products, and then only 3 weeks ago, the new chair and a senior board member had to quit over sex scandals, which didn't occur, one of which did not occur on their watch. It occurred on the previous board's watch. So pension funds, again, were central to the outcome in AMP. So good news on the way, David. We're going to take you over from down under.
So on that note of optimism from Tasmania, we're moving quickly from Tasmania to Tuscany. And so now I'll move to Konstantinos, and just one quick remark is that it's true that we have the paritarian system in Europe, in many European jurisdictions, and so workers and employees are perhaps better represented on the board, and better structured perhaps on the board of many of these mainland European pension funds. However, the pool of money that they oversee is much smaller than the ones you guys have in Boston or Canberra or Sydney. Konstantinos, over to you for the concluding reply.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thanks to Nick and to David for their questions and comments. Very, very quickly, David, in the US, exactly because you have the 2 extremes, which means the one extreme being hostility, we do not want them on boards, and the other extreme being 40% for some types of companies for wealth redistribution and tackling economic inequality. I think that's why our proposal makes perfect sense, even in the US context. And actually, I'm not surprised because James McRitchie, shareholder advocate, has already started using our paper and our proposal when formulating shareholder proposals with US companies this year. Because he also finds that, I hope James doesn't mind me saying this, that exactly because we have gradual improvement of knowledge gaps and empowering employees without touching the 2 extremes, that's something that everyone can accept because there is flexibility and malleability to the proposals. And to Nick, Nick, you are right, but the problem, Nick, is that in the UK or in many, many other EU member states, the hostility remains against employees when it comes down to how far can we let them be part of the corporate governance processes. So although we do agree that we should go with much more drastic solutions, and I'm sure Nick would agree with me on this, we are trying to find something in between in order for no one to have an excuse by saying we do not want this because it's too radical or it's too inconvenient. So basically allow the bottom finally to put some pressure on the top instead of having either the US Department of Labor or the European Commission doing bad or good things, in my humble opinion. So leave the top-down trend in law and in markets, start building mechanisms for bottom-up approaches. Otherwise, stakeholders will keep on being marginalized and will keep on feeling more and more weakened by the whole system. Thank you again. I do appreciate it.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Thank you. Fascinating session to be continued soon, hopefully.
In Paris.
Exactly, in Paris, when the COVID situation allows it. À très bientôt.